and welcome to The Briefing, a co-production of The Appeal and Now This. I'm Jay Willis, senior contributor at The Appeal, and your host for today's Forum for Candidates for House Foreign Affairs Committee chair in the upcoming Congress. So we've invited the three declared Democratic candidates. That's California's Brad Sherman, New York's Gregory Meeks, and Texas's Joaquin Castro. And with us today is Representative Castro, along with folks from a few leading organizations in the foreign policy debate. That's Erica Fine, Advocacy Director for Win Without War, which works to advance a peaceful, progressive U.S. foreign policy. And also Yasmin Tayeb, Senior Policy Counsel at Demand Progress, who is leading that organization's advocacy efforts on ending militarism at home and abroad. So they'll be jumping in to ask a few questions as sort of lightning round guest hosts. A little bit of background on this position. So the current Foreign Affairs Committee chair is New York Representative Eliot Engel, but Engel's lost to challenger Jamal Bowman in the Democratic primary this past June, I believe, will create a vacancy for that spot. Chairmanship of the House Foreign Affairs Committee is typically reserved for the committee's most senior member, although there have been exceptions to that pattern. So for example, Representative Sherman was previously passed over for the job in favor of the less senior Representative Engel. In the 200 years since the chairmanship's creation, all but one of the people who have filled it have been white men. So the committee itself has jurisdiction over legislation and investigations related to foreign affairs, including into presidential conduct internationally, which has been a rather newsworthy subject of late. The committee can also conduct investigations into agencies that operate outside the United States. So for example, we're talking about the Guantanamo Bay detention facilities, invocations of the War Powers Resolution and authorizations to use military force, and then also in other matters related to international diplomacy, including the imposition of sanctions, immigration reform, and many more. So Congressman, again, thank you for joining us today. Before I get into some of the details of your hypothetical future chairmanship, I want to ask about a much more immediate issue with which the country is grappling right now. The ongoing protests of the police shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin, a teenage shooter who killed two demonstrators and injured a third, sort of in the aftermath of that. And then more generally, the larger crisis of unchecked police violence that we see in this country against communities of color. This is obviously not the first time this country has sort of come face to face with that in the last several months, years, decades. But what are your House colleagues saying about this right now? And do we have any shot at some sort of meaningful legislation, some sort of meaningful attempt at reform in the next couple months before the election?
Well, I can tell you this, that a majority of our House colleagues see this as a fundamental human rights issue and are extremely concerned about police abuses, law enforcement abuses that we've seen across the country. The House did pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act not too long ago, but the United States Senate has sat on that piece of legislation, unfortunately. Let me say this, because it's an area that I've also worked a great deal on. My brother, Julian Castro, when he ran for president, talked about this issue at length many times. And the development of technology has forced us to grapple with some very ugly truths in our country. For generations, there were many Black men and women and others who would file complaints about police abuse and police brutality, and those complaints would go nowhere because it often came down to this issue of credibility. The credibility of an esteemed police officer in society versus the credibility of somebody on the street that officer encountered. And because there was no video evidence or documentary evidence other than filing a police complaint or an internal affairs complaint, oftentimes these issues went unresolved and people were injured, there were people that were killed, and there are people that suffered severe emotional distress that lasted often the rest of their life because of what they experienced. And then we went from this dispute over credibility into an era of what I would call dispute of interpretation. And the Rodney King tape was actually a preview of what we would see many years later, where we all witnessed on videotape Rodney King being beaten up. So then it became a dispute over interpretation. Was Rodney King still a danger to police? Was Eric Gardner still a danger to police? Was Tamir Rice, were the police supposed to know that he was carrying a toy gun instead of a real gun, even though he's a 12-year-old boy? And so we stayed in that period for quite a while. I think what has changed now, especially with the George Floyd case, and now also with the Jacob Blake case, is that we have moved beyond this debate over interpretation or the excuses of interpretation. And it's clear to the country and undeniable that African Americans are being abused and sometimes killed by law enforcement. And that's why it's incumbent upon the country to act. And this has also an importance for our foreign policy. I know you got many questions, so I'll wrap up this answer. It's got an importance to our foreign policy because we can't buy enough tanks or jets or guns to convince the people of this world that we should be a North Star for the world. The only way we can do that is by being a North Star within our own country, by leading by example, by respecting the human rights of everyone who calls this place home. And that's part of the reason that we also have to make sure that we solve this problem.
Thank you, Congressman. Turning to the sort of the subject matter at hand, I referenced a little bit in the introduction, sort of the tradition of seniority in awarding the chairmanship of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Why has that been the case? And also, why do you think there's more of sort of an open race for the position this year?
Well, I think things are changing. I think that people, voters, members of Congress, there are a lot of folks that want to do things differently, that are questioning the seniority system. That's not to say that seniority and experience don't matter at all or that they should be completely disregarded. But as you mentioned, we've had a system within the Democratic caucus that for years has put seniority way above anything else. I believe that, and I think many folks believe that the consideration should not only be your experience, but also your vision for the committee, the direction that you want to take the committee, the issues that you want to take on. And so you see a lot of members of the Democratic caucus moving in that direction. You saw some of that in 2017 when we created these vice chair positions. I now serve as vice chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee and also chair of the subcommittee on oversight and investigations. And so, there's finally a reevaluation of that seniority system and this idea that, perhaps we should consider other things as well.
Thanks. So first, I want to ask about foreign affairs in the context of the last couple of years and the Trump administration. So from escalating tensions with nations like Iran and Venezuela, to turning a blind eye to human rights abusers in Saudi Arabia, all the way to withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement. There's been this pattern that we've seen, right, of President Trump promoting his own interests at the expense of national and international security. So again, reflecting on the last 4 years, how do you evaluate Congressman Engel's performance as chair in holding the Trump administration to account? And perhaps more specifically, in what ways do you think he's come up short?
Well, I have a great deal of respect for Elliot. He spent more than 30 years in the House of Representatives, and I believe worked in earnest to take on the Trump administration on many fronts. I do believe that this administration's policies have been a disaster, that the strength of the United States around the world as a leader among nations has been that we have been perceived by many places as a North Star for the things that for generations we've stood for protecting human rights, for democracy, for freedom, for rooting out corruption. And what you see is that President Trump has either contributed to the corruption, for example, or has completely ignored things like human rights abuses. So there are more authoritarians around the world right now who feel free to abuse their people or abuse the people in neighboring countries because they feel like the United States and no one else is watching them or keeping them in check, even through diplomatic means, even by bringing up the issue. The president has been very reluctant to criticize Russia, for example, on some of its human rights abuses, and other nations, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and how he's treating the indigenous people there, the issue of the Rohingya. And so there's so many nations where authoritarian leaders feel emboldened now because President Trump has disengaged us from being a North Star on these issues.
Thanks. Next up, as mentioned, I'll invite Erica Fine of Win Without War to ask a question about AUMFs. Erica, thanks for joining us. Take it away.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you to Now This and to the Appeal for hosting us today. And thank you, Congressman Castro, for shaking things up prompting this conversation by entering the HVAC chair race. It's really great to be with you. It's a common refrain that people in this country don't care about foreign policy, but we know that that's not true. So it's on behalf of the 15,000 activists who weighed in through Win Without War, urging that the next chair be a progressive and promote a progressive foreign policy, and the 900 people who took time to send in questions for this forum that I ask this next question. So over the last few years, the House twice passed legislation repealing the 2001 and 2002 authorizations for use of military force, though the Senate has not taken up either bill. The 2001 AUMF was passed in response to 9/11, and the 2002 authorized the Iraq War. Both have been abused by presidents to justify international military action far beyond their original intended purposes, what we now call forever wars. Do you support repealing the 2001 and 2002 AUMFs? And more broadly, will you support legislation reforming the War Powers Resolution to strengthen congressional oversight and prevent these kind of AUMFs from being used to justify perpetual war?
I absolutely will, and I'm glad to have supported repeal of both AUMFs. I believe that over the years, the executive branch has taken power from the legislative branch when it comes to matters of war and military action. But I have to be honest with you as well. The Congress has also acquiesced and given up some of that power to the executive branch. But it's important to realize that the American people don't pay us as members of Congress to duck the tough decisions. They don't pay us to be spectators to the most important decision a nation can make, which is to wage war against another country. And so Congress has to reassert itself. And if I'm elected chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, that's exactly what we'll do. We'll do everything that we can. I hope that Joe Biden is elected. So I say, God forbid if President Trump is reelected, but we're going to give him hell. We're going to make sure that we fight him every step of the way as they try to hold on to and usurp more power from the legislative branch on making decisions about war and military action. And if President Biden is elected, then I hope that we can work as a partner to make sure that we end forever wars, that we don't get into more endless conflicts. But look, regardless of who's president, the legislative branch and this committee in particular have to be a check on the executive branch, not because we want to on a whim, but because that's what the Constitution calls for. It calls for that oversight. And so I want to help us reclaim that power. I have served since I got to Congress, I've been on the Armed Services Committee, the Intelligence Committee, and the Foreign Affairs Committee. The only one who's running for this office who has served on even two of those committees. Brad Sherman and Greg Meeks, who are both friends of mine, have been on the committee longer, but they both have served on foreign affairs, and they both chose to take subcommittee chairmanships, not in foreign affairs on the Foreign Affairs Committee, but on the Financial Services Committee. So they both chair subcommittees on financial services. I have steeped myself for the last 7 or 8 years on these issues and seen them from 3 different important angles.
Thank you, Congressman, and thanks again, Erica, for dropping in. Congressman, you mentioned Vice President Biden, the Democratic nominee. I want to turn to him and his platform now. How do your views on foreign policy align with those of Vice President Biden, and where specifically do you think your views differ?
That's a great question. And I'll be honest with you, because he hasn't taken office yet and started enacting his policies, we're going to have to see exactly where we may have specific differences. I can tell you where we agree for now, and then what my intentions are if I'm chair. Where we agree is that President Trump has made a mess of the world. As I mentioned, the United States has been perceived as a North Star. President Trump has had a chaotic, not a coherent, and not a comprehensive foreign policy. That has actually destabilized the world, I believe, made the United States less safe, and also made our allies less safe. At the same time, although the president has talked and tried to sell himself as somebody who's going to end forever wars, there's actually more troops deployed now, I believe, than when President Trump took office. And so I believe that Joe Biden is going to make an earnest attempt to fix that. The first thing that I think we need to work with a new President Biden on is a damage assessment, particularly at the State Department. Remember, when you have a debilitated State Department, when you have a weakened State Department, what happens both in the Congress and in the executive branch is that you start using your military apparatus as a crutch. And the center of gravity, the center of power, the way that you get things done moves from diplomacy over to military action. So we need a damage assessment about exactly what President Trump has done to the State Department. The morale is the lowest it's ever been. There's less people applying to the diplomatic corps. More people are walking out the door at a faster rate than ever before. So you've got to be able to go in there and fix the State Department, fix your infrastructure for diplomacy. And then I believe, as I mentioned, work with the executive branch. And I would actually make this plea of a President Biden. I know that traditionally presidents are reluctant to give up power to the legislative branch. But remember, Vice President Biden is somebody who chaired the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate. He understands the role of Congress in these decisions. And I would ask the executive branch and the president to be mindful, to be respectful, and share power with the Congress, because he knows how important that role is for Congress.
Thanks. I want to turn now to the COVID-19 pandemic and the relationship to the Foreign Affairs Committee's jurisdiction. So far, the death toll from the coronavirus crisis is over 800,000 people globally, along with more than 180,000 people here in the United States. What do you think the United States can do to assume a leadership role in the international humanitarian response, and in particular to ensure that more vulnerable communities and nations are not left out of that?
Well, the first thing, and it sounds really simple, but we have to care again. You need a president and a Congress, both chambers of Congress, that actually care, that seek to be a leader and a healer of nations and an ally for the nations around the world as they go through their own suffering with COVID-19. As y'all know, there are a lot of nations that don't have the equipment or the technology that the United States has. So for example, I am pressing now and supporting in Congress, adding $20 billion for additional assistance to nations around the world to deal with COVID-19. I also believe that we shouldn't be disengaging from things like the World Health Organization, that the United States should dig in and be greater partners in solving these challenges globally. And what this moment has reminded us of again, because the world has historically gone through these periods before. You take the Spanish flu, for example, about 100 years ago, that was a global pandemic. We've gone through this before, but it's shown that, while you can try to regulate and limit the movement of capital, of labor, of different things, you can't so easily regulate the movement of something natural like a virus. And that means that this is a global challenge, and we should be leaders on it.
I want to turn now to two of the U.S.'s relationships with foreign nations that have been in the headlines a lot. The first is Iran. So Vice President Biden has indicated that he would seek to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal if elected, and that's a position, obviously, that's also in the DNC platform. And as recently as 5 years ago, in 2015, there was an intense campaign to block the deal, and you even had some Democratic lawmakers joining Republicans to unsuccessfully try to stop it. So this is a position that has garnered criticism from both sides. What would be your position on re-entry into the Iran deal?
I was proud to support the Iran deal a few years ago, and I believe that we should rejoin the Iran deal. The Iran deal was working for the purposes for which we entered it, which was to contain Iran's nuclear program. I have an interest, and I believe we all have an interest, in nuclear nonproliferation. And that deal was successful and was being successful in containing Iran's nuclear program. Unfortunately, we have President Trump, who has withdrawn from the agreement and then ridiculously tried to, once he withdrew, claim that as still a party to the agreement, he could use the snapback provisions of the agreement. And so, as I mentioned before, this approach has been completely chaotic. I think has not helped stabilize the region, has destabilized it, has inflamed tensions in the region, has made our allies, our NATO allies in particular, and countries like Germany and France doubt the ability of the United States to be leaders on these issues, to bring parties to the table, to negotiate things like the Iran deal. And I also think it's done something else. It's made countries wonder whether every 4 years, when you change administrations, presidential administrations, if they sign a deal with the United States under a Democratic administration, is somebody like President Trump just going to come along and tear that deal up? And whether we're going to actually keep our word and see the deal through. So I think that we should get back in. I look forward to working hopefully with Vice President or President Biden at the time and the administration to usher us back into the Iran deal.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of sort of the result of the back and forth of the Paris Climate Agreement, right? Where we entered into it, there was sort of this status quo that developed, and then President Trump's withdrawal from it sort of plunged it into a little bit more chaos. How do you think that re-entering the Paris Climate Agreement would affect America's position sort of as a leader in global diplomacy again?
Well, what's interesting is that, and many of us believed that this would happen, not only around the world, but even in the United States, clean energy and renewable energy, the things that will get us to net zero, right? Those have actually proliferated and been more successful over the last several years. And so it's interesting to watch in my home state of Texas, where Texas is a leader in wind energy, increasingly a leader in solar, the things that, again, would make us successful as a party to the Paris Climate Accord. And so I think that what it would do is send a strong signal to the world, us getting back into that agreement, that we take these issues of climate change seriously, that we don't have an administration that denies climate science and the existence of climate change. And that's important for a host of reasons. As I'm sure you all know, right now, there's 80 million people around the world who are displaced from their homes. Some of those folks are climate refugees, and some of them have gone from one country to another. However, there's some who are moving around within their own country. And I'll just take, the last example of this hurricane here on the Gulf Coast. There was a photo in the San Antonio Express News, I believe it was in our newspaper, a photograph and also video of all of the cars that had come from Houston, Texas, and the Gulf Coast, and were just lined up waiting in San Antonio, trying to wait out this hurricane. Those folks also are being affected, Americans deeply affected by climate. So I see this issue as an important foreign policy and global issue, but it's also, quite honestly, an issue that's very important to Americans who live in my home state.
Thanks. So last subject I want to turn to before kicking it to Yasmin for a question is that of China, which over the past several years has sought to impose restrictive new laws on the historically independent city-state of Hong Kong. China is also building out land in the South China Sea and laying claim to territory that would allow it to control about a third of international global shipping, which is nearly a fifth of the total value of global trade. So we've seen President Trump escalate trade tensions with China in his trade wars, while failing to use US leverage and diplomacy to curb China's increasing authoritarianism. So given the need for cooperation with China now on this climate crisis that we've talked about, as well as the coronavirus crisis and global health, how would you try and steer sort of this massively important relationship as chair? And then what should happen, if anything, specifically in response to Hong Kong and the developments in the South China Sea?
You ask a great question, a tough question and a complicated question, because the US relationship with China is filled with many ironies and conundrums. China is our biggest trading partner, but also, particularly under President Trump, has become one of our biggest adversaries. You're talking about the world's largest and second largest economy. There are things that we work with China on or can work with them on. We just talked about climate change. That's one example of something that we can work with China on that's gravely important to the world. And then we also have very fundamental disagreements with them. For example, the issue of their treatment of Uyghur Muslims and how they have been put into camps. That is a clear and strong violation of human rights. And I believe, and I've said, that one of the things the Foreign Affairs Committee has a role in doing is really focusing in and highlighting that human rights violation and working with the executive branch in a diplomatic way to put pressure on China to change that. But it's going to be hard to do that when you go it alone, as President Trump has done. We need to marshal the strength of our allies to put pressure on China to change. The same thing with Hong Kong. You need to be able to put pressure with your allies to get China to change. Remember, for China, it has been a rapidly growing economy and country, and increasingly they're in markets beyond Asia, obviously in the United States, in Europe. They're trying to make headway in Africa and Latin America with their One Belt, One Road initiative. And so the more they expand into the world, that actually, I believe, gives us more diplomatic leverage to put pressure on them to change, because now they have a stake in the perspectives and the opinions and the markets of the people in those places. And so we have to be able to use that leverage to put pressure on them to change, including on their work in the South China Sea. You know, I started 2 foreign affairs caucuses during my time in Congress so far. I started the U.S.-Japan caucus, co-founder and co-chair of the U.S.-Japan caucus in 2013 with none other than Devin Nunes before he was chair of the Intelligence Committee. And then I started the U.S.-ASEAN caucus in 2017 with Ann Wagner, Republican of Missouri, to strengthen the relationship between members of the U.S. Congress and members of the Japanese Diet, for example, and of course the legislative bodies of the nations of ASEAN. And that's what we need to do more of, so that we increase our soft power in those nations by strengthening the relationships among our legislators.
That prompted one more question I wanted to ask you about. You mentioned your relationship in starting that caucus with Congressman Nunes. You know, there's this pervasive narrative about hyperpartisanship in Washington, but as members of Congress, you know, deal with foreign affairs, it's really important to present a united national front. Can you discuss a little bit your relationships with folks, particularly on the other side of the aisle, and how, if elected to this position, you think those would help you in implementing an agenda?
And you're right about a united front. You know, I've talked about change and kind of a fresh generation and new ideas and so forth, but there's still an old school idea I follow, which is when I'm traveling overseas in a bipartisan delegation, for example, I don't ever get into public fights with Republicans, even that I strongly disagree with. And I have been, for example, in rooms at the Munich Security Conference a few years ago with Darrell Issa, in Japan with folks that I have strong disagreements with on policy, but don't take those disagreements out in front of an international audience when we're in another country. I think it's important that we can settle those things back home, but as a country, we have to stay united when we're out in the world. And so you ask about the hyperpartisanship. You're right. I mean, look, Congress is a place of a lot of gridlock right now. That's been the case for many years. The answer is a longer conversation on this about how we approach it. But basically, the institution of Congress itself, if you look at it, it was pretty much built for fighting. It was built to have the two sides almost constantly at each other. And I say that as somebody who served in a different kind of system, the Texas legislature, where, for example, you still had a handful of committees and still have a handful of committees that are chaired by members of the minority party. That's unthinkable in the US House of Representatives, right? But despite that, there's still good legislation every term that is worked on and passed in a bipartisan way. So for example, last term I worked with Mike McCall, who's the ranking member on Foreign Affairs, but at the time he was the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee. We worked on cybersecurity issues together, and I was able to make some amendments to his big cyber bill a few years ago. I worked with Representative Curtis on the Hong Kong legislation this year, a Republican, on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and also have worked with other Republicans, including Tea Party Republicans and Freedom Caucus Republicans on legislation, on global democracy, for example. So there are opportunities to work with people in ways that are bipartisan. Now, this is the kind of the last thing that I'll say on this part. It's important that we do everything that we can to work with each other where we can. But the committee has also worked in a way that has demanded not just consensus, but oftentimes unanimity, where I've seen at times things will start to slow down on the Foreign Affairs Committee because not every single Republican agrees with what we're doing. I think we should work in a bipartisan way, but we should not require a unanimity of thought where we don't move a bill that Democrats or progressives are excited about simply because you have one or two Republican holdouts on the committee.
Thank you, Congressman. To close out today, I want to turn it over to Yasmeen Taeb of Demand Progress, who is going to ask a little bit about a subject that you touched on earlier, but the relationship between the Foreign Affairs Committee and systemic racism and police brutality here in the United States. So Yasmeen, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Jay, and Now This, and the Appeal for hosting us. And thank you so much, Congressman Castro, for joining us. As you know, 70 progressive faith and anti-war organizations representing tens of millions of our members across the country sent a letter to House Democratic leadership last month calling on the next Foreign Affairs Committee chair to advance a vision of military restraint and progressive realism. Our organizations believe that domestic police militarization, surveillance, institutionalized racism, and Islamophobia are directly tied to our militarized foreign policy, in part because they both entail the exploitation and dehumanization of communities of color. As chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, in what ways will you highlight and impact domestic issues such as systemic racism and efforts to curb police militarization, including, for example, the transfer of military equipment and weapons of war to domestic police forces under the Pentagon's 1033 program?
At a time where technology has allowed all of us, including the world, to see what happens in the United States, we can no longer just claim to be leaders on things like human rights or democracy or freedom or rooting out corruption, respecting the rights of everyone. We have to make sure that every single day in every place in this country, we live those values and those principles. And it's clear that our policing system is broken. One reason it's broken is because we have over-militarized our police and we've over-criminalized certain populations, including the African-American population in this country. And so with a case like Jacob Blake, I don't, some people assume that because he starts to head into his car, that he's reaching for a gun or reaching for a knife. That represents an assumption of criminalization of someone and a dehumanizing of someone. So it matters what we do here, even though I would be Foreign Affairs Chair, it matters what we do here, because unless we can only be seen as leaders and speak with any kind of moral authority around the world if we get it done right here, if we treat Americans with respect in our country and we respect the rights of everyone in our country. We have to be able to achieve that in order to go out to other nations around the world and ask them to do the same thing with their people.
Thank you, Congressman. I think that's as good a place as any, to leave it. I want to thank you again for joining us for this forum this afternoon. Thank you to Yasmeen and Erica for those questions, and to all our viewers at home. Thank you for tuning in. This has been The Briefing. Have a good and safe weekend.